Picture this, a quiet stretch of shoreline on the coast of what we now call North Carolina. Over 400 years ago, the year is 1587. A small English settlement sits nestled among the trees, a fragile outpost of the New World. Men, women, and children go about their lives, building homes, tending crops, praying for survival. And then, just like that, they vanish. Not a single soul remains. No signs of struggle, no graves, no answers. Only a single cryptic word carved into a wooden post, CROATOAN. 115 people gone. It's a mystery that has lingered in America's imagination for centuries, an enigma wrapped in silence and shadow. How does an entire community simply disappear? What forces, natural or human, could erase every trace of their existence? This is the story of the lost colony of Roanoke, a puzzle that has fascinated historians, haunted storytellers, and defied explanation generation after generation. We're about to walk back through time into the wilderness of the late 16th century to uncover one of history's most enduring riddles. You'll step onto the shores where these settlers made their home, feel the uncertainty they faced daily, and witness the eerie emptiness that greeted their would-be rescuers. This isn't just a tale about a missing group of people, it's a window into the courage and fragility of human ambition, into what happens when hope meets the unknown. We'll explore the clues left behind, the theories that have emerged over the ages, and why, after all this time, the disappearance of the Roanoke colonists remains an open question. So join me as we dive deep into the evidence, the myths, and the unanswered questions surrounding this legendary vanishing. We'll look at everything from potential integration with local indigenous tribes to the possibility of tragic conflict, from environmental pressures to pure speculation. This is more than history, it's a real-life mystery waiting to be solved, and by the end of our journey, you just might have your own theory about what truly happened to the lost colonists of Roanoke. To understand why these 115 people were on that distant shore in the first place, we need to step even further back into the glittering but treacherous world of Elizabethan England. The late 1500s were a time of immense ambition and fierce competition among European powers. Spain was the undisputed superpower of the age, its coffers overflowing with gold and silver plundered from its vast empires in Mexico and South America. England, under the shrewd and calculating rule of Queen Elizabeth I, watched with a mixture of envy and alarm. She knew that for her island nation to truly secure its place on the world stage, and to defend itself against the overwhelming might of Catholic Spain, it needed its own source of wealth and a strategic foothold in the New World. This wasn't just about national pride, it was a matter of economic survival and military strategy. England needed to break Spain's monopoly on New World riches. The dream was to find precious metals, establish new trade routes for valuable commodities like timber and sassafras, and create a permanent market for English goods. Furthermore, a successful colony could serve as a perfect base for privateers, state-sanctioned pirates like Sir Francis Drake, to raid and harass Spanish treasure ships as they sailed up the coast from the Caribbean. Enter Sir Walter Raleigh, a charismatic favorite of the Queen's court. Dashing, ambitious, and fiercely intelligent, Raleigh secured a charter from Elizabeth herself to explore and colonize the unknown lands of North America. His vision was grand, to create a permanent English settlement that would bear the name Virginia in honor of the never-married Virgin Queen. This endeavor was a potent mix of personal ambition, national interest, and a genuine, if perhaps naive, sense of adventure. Raleigh and his investors weren't just sending soldiers, they were sending families, craftsmen, and farmers with the intention of building a lasting community, a little piece of England across the Atlantic. Beyond the gold and the glory, there were other powerful forces at work. Religious tensions were running high in Europe. England had broken from the Catholic Church, and establishing a Protestant colony in the Americas was seen as a way to counter the spread of Spanish Catholicism. It was also an opportunity to export what many believed was a superior way of life, to civilize what they considered a wilderness, and to convert the local indigenous populations to Christianity. All of these motivations, economic, political, and religious, converged to propel those first brave, or perhaps desperate, settlers across a terrifying and vast ocean toward an uncertain future on the remote shores of Roanoke Island. The first chapter of this story begins not with a colony but with a scouting party. In 1584, Sir Walter Raleigh dispatched two captains, Philip Amadis and Arthur Barlow, on a critical mission. Their orders were not to settle but to survey. They were to find a suitable location, assess the resources, and most importantly, establish contact with the local inhabitants. Sailing across the Atlantic in two small ships, they finally made landfall on the outer banks of present-day North Carolina. The account written by Barlow upon their return paints a picture of an almost mythical paradise. He described the scent of sweet, fertile soil wafting miles out to sea, a land so rich and abundant it seemed to promise effortless prosperity. The forests were dense with towering cedars and pines, perfect for shipbuilding, and the waters teemed with fish and crabs. It was, in their eyes, a virgin land of unimaginable potential. It was here, on these barrier islands, that the English had their first recorded encounter with the CROATOAN people, a branch of the Algonquian-speaking tribes who had inhabited the coastal region for generations. The initial meeting was one of mutual curiosity, not conflict. A group of CROATOAN approached the English in a canoe, and after some cautious gestures, a dialogue was established. The CROATOAN were a sophisticated people with a deep understanding of their environment. They lived in villages of longhouses surrounded by cultivated fields of corn, beans, and squash. Their society was organized under a chief, or werowance, named Wingina, who ruled over several towns. The English were fascinated by their canoes, hollowed out from immense trees, and their fishing weirs, intricate traps built from reeds and wood that demonstrated advanced knowledge of local ecosystems. The relationship began with a gesture of remarkable hospitality. The CROATOAN invited Amadis and Barlow back to their main village on Roanoke Island, a place called Daceman-Kepuk. For several weeks, the Englishmen lived among them, sharing meals and exchanging gifts. Barlow's journal is filled with admiration for the CROATOAN's generosity and the orderly nature of their society. He was particularly taken by the mother of the local werowance, who treated the foreigners with immense kindness. This period of peaceful exchange created a dangerously optimistic impression. The CROATOAN appeared friendly, even eager to trade. They seemed to have no weapons of iron or steel, only tools and arrowheads made of stone and bone, which led the English to vastly underestimate their strength and resilience. Barlow returned to England with not only samples of local plants and pearls, but also two enthralled CROATOAN men, Manteo and Wanchese, who had agreed to make the journey. His reports described a veritable Eden, a land of gentle, welcoming people and boundless opportunity. This glowing assessment, however, failed to grasp the complex political realities of the region. The CROATOAN were not living in isolated peace. They were part of a delicate web of alliances and rivalries with neighboring tribes like the Roanoke and the Powhatan to the north. This idyllic first impression, built on a foundation of mutual misunderstanding and short-term goodwill, set the stage for all the tragedy and mystery that was to follow. Buoyed by those glowing reports, Sir Walter Raleigh moved swiftly to establish a permanent foothold. The following year, in 1585, he sent a much larger expedition, this one led by the seasoned soldier and former Irish governor Sir Richard Grenville. But this group was fundamentally different from the earlier scouts. Grenville's fleet carried over 100 men, most of them soldiers, not farmers or families. Their mission was not just to explore but to conquer and hold territory. This was to be a military garrison, a fortress from which England could project its power. Among the passengers were the two CROATOAN men, Manteo and Wanchese, returning home. their perspectives on the English irrevocably altered by their time in London. Upon arrival, the English quickly set about building a fort on the northern end of Roanoke Island. They named it Fort Raleigh, a sturdy, earthwork fortification designed to withstand an attack. But from the very beginning, the effort was plagued by misfortune. A critical event set a dark tone for the entire endeavor. Shortly after landing, a silver cup went missing from one of the English camps. Convinced it had been stolen by the nearby Aquascogoc village, Grenville and his men reacted with disproportionate fury. They burned the entire village to the ground and destroyed the community's cornfields. This brutal act of collective punishment was a catastrophic miscalculation, instantly shattering any trust the Secautan peoples might have had and broadcasting a message of hostility and irrational violence. The English had traded diplomacy for intimidation, a strategy that would soon backfire. The situation grew increasingly dire under the command of Ralph Lane, a military man left in charge when Grenville sailed back to England for supplies. Lane was a soldier through and through, more concerned with securing the island against Spanish attack than with building a sustainable community. He focused his efforts on further exploration, hoping to find the legendary gold mines or a passage to the Pacific Ocean that would justify their suffering. But the practical needs of his men were ignored. They had arrived too late in the season to plant crops, and the supplies they brought were quickly dwindling. The promised paradise revealed itself to be a place of harsh realities, bitter winters, unfamiliar diseases, and a land that could not be forced to provide sustenance on command. Their survival became entirely dependent on the very people they had alienated. The English were forced to rely on the Secautan for food, but the relationship was now one of tense extortion, not mutual trade. Lane's men would frequently march into Secautan villages and demand their entire store of corn, leaving the inhabitants with little for themselves. This desperate bullying created a powder keg of resentment. The Secautan leader, Wingina, watched as his people's carefully stored winter supplies were taken by these increasingly hostile and unpredictable foreigners. He began to distance himself, moving his people away from the island to the mainland, and even changing his own name to Pemasapan, which some scholars believe signified a shift in his strategy from cooperation to resistance. The atmosphere on Roanoke Island grew thick with paranoia and fear. Lane suspected plots everywhere, and his heavy-handed tactics only isolated the colony further. The breaking point came in the early summer of 1586. Believing, perhaps correctly, that Pemasapan was organizing a coordinated attack from multiple tribes, Lane decided on a preemptive strike. In a ruthless ambush, he and his men attacked the Secautan leadership, killing Pemasapan and several of his key advisors. This act of outright warfare guaranteed that the English could no longer expect any help from the local population. They were now completely alone, starving, and surrounded by enemies who had every reason to want them gone. Salvation arrived from an entirely unexpected direction. Just days after this violent clash, the sails of a massive fleet appeared on the horizon. It was not Grenville returning with supplies, but the famous privateer Sir Francis Drake, fresh from raiding Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. He offered the beleaguered colonists a choice. They could have enough supplies and a small ship to continue their efforts, or they could abandon the post and sail home with him to England. After a hurricane destroyed the offered ship and with starvation looming, the choice was clear. Every single colonist, defeated and desperate, accepted passage on Drake's fleet. They left behind a hollow fort and a legacy of violence, their dreams of a new world fortune replaced by the simple, overwhelming relief of survival. The first English attempt at a colony in America had ended in total failure, leaving behind only empty buildings and a deeply embittered landscape. Back in England, however, the failure of the first colony was not seen as a final verdict. Sir Walter Raleigh remained undeterred, convinced that the fundamental idea was sound even if the execution had been flawed. he quickly organized a third and what would become the final expedition. But this endeavor was conceived on an entirely different principle. Learning from Ralph Lane's military failure, Raleigh understood that a garrison of soldiers could never create a lasting community. For a colony to truly take root, it needed to be a society from its very inception. This time, the passengers would not be soldiers, but families, men, women, and even children who carried with them the tools, seeds, and hopes for a permanent life in the New World. To lead this vulnerable and hopeful group, Raleigh chose a man not known for his martial prowess but for his keen eye and gentle spirit, John White. White was an artist and cartographer who had been part of the previous Grenville expedition. His beautifully detailed watercolor paintings of the CROATOAN people, their villages, and the local flora and fauna were among the most valuable records brought back from the New World. He was an observer, a documentarian, not a conqueror. His appointment as governor signaled a profound shift in strategy from one of subjugation to one of settlement. The plan itself was also far more ambitious. They were not to return to the site of the failed fort on Roanoke Island, a place now stained with blood and betrayal. Instead, their charter directed them to sail north into the great bay called Chesapeake by the local tribes. This location was chosen for its deeper harbors, which could accommodate larger ships, and its reputation for more fertile land. It was, by all accounts, a superior location for the city of Raleigh they intended to build. In the spring of 1587, 115 settlers boarded a small fleet of ships and set sail into the unknown. This community included 17 women and 11 children, a clear declaration that they were there to stay. Among them was Governor White's own family, his daughter Elena, who was pregnant, and her husband, the bricklayer Ananias Dare. The journey was long and arduous, fraught with the typical perils of Atlantic crossings in that era. But they arrived on the Outer Banks in late July, their spirits likely lifting at the sight of land. It was here that the first twist of fate occurred, a decision that would seal their destiny. The pilot of their ships, a Portuguese navigator named Simon Fernandez, announced that he would take them no further. He declared that the season was too advanced to risk the journey up the coast to the Chesapeake, and he insisted they disembark here on Roanoke Island. His motives remain one of the many murky sub-mysteries of the tale. Was he simply being cautious? Was he under secret orders? Or was he perhaps more interested in returning to the lucrative business of privateering against Spanish ships than in ferrying settlers to a new home? Regardless of his reasons, his refusal was absolute. Against Governor White's wishes and the colony's very charter, the 115 men, women, and children were deposited not at their promised land, but at the site of their predecessors' failure. They stepped ashore to a ghost town. The fort Ralph Lane had built was still standing, but it was deserted and dilapidated. The houses were empty, overgrown with vines. The only sign of life was the bleached skeleton of one of the men Grenville had left behind, a grim warning of what might await them. Yet, with no other choice, they began the difficult work of repairing the structures and trying to make a home. They tried to reconnect with the CROATOAN people, but the memory of Lane's violence was still fresh. The local tribes were rightfully wary and largely kept their distance, though they did report that the 15 men Grenville had left had been attacked, with several killed and the fate of the others unknown. The fragile hope for peaceful coexistence was already fading. Despite the ominous setting, a moment of profound joy occurred just weeks after their arrival. On August 18, 1587, Elena Dare gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Virginia in honor of the land that was now her birthplace and their intended kingdom. Little Virginia Dare was the first child of English parents to be born in the Americas, a symbol of the future this colony was supposed to represent. Her birth was a beacon of hope, a tangible investment in a new world. But that hope was fragile, existing within a tightening circle of anxiety. Supplies were running dangerously low, and the hostility of their environment was becoming ever more apparent. The settlers held a meeting and made a collective, desperate decision. They pleaded with Governor White, their leader and now a grandfather, to sail back to England himself. He was the one man they could trust to passionately convey their dire circumstances and return with the reinforcements and provisions they needed to survive. It was an agonizing choice for White to leave his daughter and newborn granddaughter in such a perilous situation, but he agreed, seeing it as their only chance. Amidst this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, one relationship offered a glimmer of hope, a thread of connection in an otherwise hostile land. That thread was a man named Manteo. Unlike the other CROATOAN who had traveled to England, Wanchese, who had returned deeply distrustful of English intentions, Manteo had formed a genuine bond with his hosts. He had learned their language, understood their customs, and had even been baptized into the Christian faith on a previous voyage. He was, for all intents and purposes, a cultural bridge. His people, the CROATOAN, lived on a barrier island to the south that now bears his name, Hatteras Island. Under the leadership of his mother, who was their chief, the CROATOAN had maintained a more cautious and less confrontational stance toward the English than their mainland cousins. Governor White, recognizing the critical importance of this alliance, made a deliberate and strategic decision. He did not see Manteo merely as a translator or a guide, he saw him as a partner. Before his departure, White organized a formal ceremony. In a gesture meant to solidify this crucial bond, he knighted Manteo, bestowing upon him the title Lord of Roanoke and Daceman Kepuk. This was an extraordinary act, an attempt to integrate a native leader directly into the English feudal structure. It was a profound recognition of Manteo's unique status and a public declaration that the survival of this colony depended on cooperation, not conquest. This relationship was the antithesis of the one Ralph Lane had fostered. Where Lane saw threats and responded with violence, White saw a potential ally and offered a title of nobility. It was a last, desperate gamble on diplomacy. This is why, when the time came for John White to make his heart-wrenching departure, he and the settlers devised a specific and detailed contingency plan. They all agreed that if the colonists were forced to abandon Roanoke Island for any reason, be it due to attack, starvation, or natural disaster, they would carve a message into a tree or post indicating their destination. And if their move was a voluntary one, made in peace, they would add a Maltese cross above the word to signify they were under duress. This plan was not conceived in a vacuum. It was created with the CROATOAN alliance firmly in mind. White was certain that if his people had to leave, the most logical and safest sanctuary would be to travel south, to integrate with Manteo's people on CROATOAN Island. He believed the CROATOANs, with their established farms and knowledge of the land, possessed the resources and the willingness to shelter over 100 newcomers. In White's mind, the fate of the colony, of his own family, was now inextricably linked to this single, hopeful connection. His entire mission to England was predicated on the belief that he would return to find the colonists either still on Roanoke or safely relocated to CROATOAN, waiting for his promised return with the supplies that would ensure their collective future. So in late August of 1587, a small ship was prepared for the governor's desperate mission. The farewell on the Roanoke shoreline was a moment of profound and heartbreaking contradiction. There was hope because a plan was in place and a leader was acting to save them. But there was also a deep, unspoken terror because that leader was leaving and they were staying behind in an increasingly precarious situation. John White embraced his daughter Elena, himself now a grandfather to the infant Virginia Dare. He looked upon the faces of the men and women who had trusted him to lead them to a new life, a community now reduced to a fragile outpost clinging to the edge of a vast continent. He made a solemn vow to them all. He would return with a massive resupply fleet as swiftly as the winds and waves would allow. He promised them relief, reinforcements, and a secure future. It was a promise made with absolute sincerity, but it was a promise that fate would conspire to break. The voyage back to England was itself a harrowing ordeal, a brutal fight against the very elements that seemed determined to keep him from his goal. The small vessel, buffeted by autumn gales, was ill-suited for a solo Atlantic crossing. Every day at sea was a day of anguish for White, knowing that with each passing moment the colony's supplies dwindled further. He must have replayed the anxious directives of the colonists in his mind, clinging to the logic of their contingency plan. If they moved, they would carve their destination. If they were in danger, they would mark it with a cross. The clarity of that plan was his only comfort, a single thread of control in a situation that was rapidly spinning into chaos. When he finally stumbled ashore in England in late autumn, exhausted and emotionally spent, he was met not with the urgent support he had envisioned, but with a nation paralyzed by a far greater threat. King Philip II of Spain had finally launched his Great Armada, a massive invasion fleet of towering warships, its sole purpose the conquest of England and the overthrow of Queen Elizabeth. The entire nation was on a war footing. Every single seaworthy vessel, every experienced sailor, and every ounce of national resources was immediately commandeered for the defense of the realm. The fate of 100-odd settlers on a distant, unnamed shore was, in the grand scheme of national survival, a tragically low priority. John White found himself trapped in a nightmare of bureaucratic impossibility and military necessity. He pleaded with Sir Walter Raleigh, he petitioned the Queen's advisors, but their attention was fixed solely on the English Channel, where the fate of their entire world would be decided. The privateering ships that Raleigh might have dispatched were instead being armed to join the fight against the Armada. For months, White could do nothing but wait, a helpless spectator to a global conflict, his mind undoubtedly tortured by visions of what might be unfolding in Virginia. He knew the colony's provisions were meant to last only through the winter. By the spring of 1588, they would have been in dire straits, and he was not there. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in the summer of 1588 was a monumental victory for England, but it did not immediately free up ships for colonial ventures. The nation was exhausted, its treasury drained by the war effort. Raleigh himself had invested heavily in the conflict, and his focus had shifted. It took 2 more years of relentless lobbying and navigating the slow gears of Elizabethan officialdom before White could secure passage on a small, privately funded supply ship. Not the grand rescue fleet he had promised, but at least it was a start. The 3-year delay was an eternity. As his ship finally approached the familiar Outer Banks in August of 1590, on the eve of his granddaughter's 3rd birthday, John White's heart must have been pounding with a terrible mixture of hope and dread. The reality that greeted John White upon his return to England was a nation bracing for an existential fight, a context far removed from the quiet desperation of a fledgling colony. The geopolitical chessboard of Europe had been tilting toward war for years, and his arrival coincided with the final, frantic moves. Spain, under the devout and determined King Philip II, viewed Protestant England as a heretical menace and a thorn in its imperial side. English privateers like Sir Francis Drake had been plundering Spanish treasure fleets for a decade, acts of piracy that Philip considered both a personal insult and a direct challenge to his divine right to rule the seas. The immense wealth flowing from the Americas was the very lifeblood of the Spanish Empire, funding its armies and its ambitions, and England's raids were a constant gnawing drain. Philip's response was the Armada, a word that would soon strike fear into the heart of every English citizen. This was not merely a fleet, it was the largest naval force ever assembled in history up to that point, a floating fortress of over 130 ships. These weren't just warships, they were towering galleons, massive troop transports, and agile support vessels, all designed for a single, terrifying purpose: to sail up the English Channel, escort a vast Spanish army waiting in the Netherlands, and force a full-scale invasion of England itself. The goal was nothing less than the conquest of the nation, the deposition of Queen Elizabeth, and the return of England to the Catholic fold. For the English, this was not a distant colonial squabble. It was a fight for their very survival, their faith, and their independence. In the face of such an overwhelming threat, every resource of the state was mobilized for defense. Queen Elizabeth's government issued orders that would have been unthinkable just months before. A general requisition seized every seaworthy vessel in English ports. The privately owned ships that Sir Walter Raleigh and other investors relied on for their colonial and privateering ventures were instantly commandeered by the Royal Navy. The skilled sailors White needed for his return voyage were pressed into service to man the guns and rigging of the warships preparing to confront the Armada. The docks, which usually bustled with the commerce of exploration, now echoed with the grim sounds of militarization, the forging of cannonballs, the stockpiling of gunpowder, and the drilling of militia. John White, an artist and governor turned desperate petitioner, found himself utterly powerless within this maelstrom of national preparation. His personal tragedy, the fate of his family and his colony, was a tiny, insignificant story against the epic narrative of a world at war. He could plead with Raleigh, but even Raleigh's influence had its limits when the Crown itself demanded every available ship. The gold and supplies that were meant for Roanoke were now diverted to fund the war effort. The nation's entire focus, its wealth, and its martial energy were funneled into a single, all-consuming objective: breaking the Spanish threat. For 3 long years, White was trapped, a hostage to a conflict whose scale he could never have imagined from the quiet shores of Roanoke. His promised swift return became an impossible dream, delayed by the relentless, unforgiving priorities of global empire and the simple, brutal arithmetic of war, where the needs of the 115 were sacrificed for the safety of millions. Imagine the sheer torment of those 3 years for John White. He was a man with a mission of life and death urgency, yet he was utterly immobilized, forced to navigate an endless maze of bureaucratic refusal and wartime necessity. His world had shrunk to the noisy, frantic docks of London and Plymouth, a place where every ship being fitted for war was a personal rebuke, a symbol of his failed promise. He was a ghost in the machinery of empire, haunting the offices of merchants and the courts of powerful men. His story of a starving colony falling on ears deafened by the drumbeats of a much larger conflict. His diary entries from this period, though few have survived, paint a picture of a soul in quiet agony. He writes of making humble suit to Sir Walter Raleigh, only to be told that every vessel was taken for the Queen's service. He describes approaching wealthy merchants, hoping to charter a small pinnace with his own meager funds, but finding no captain willing to risk a transatlantic voyage with the Spanish Armada patrolling the sea lanes. Every privateer who might have undertaken the journey for a price was already commissioned, their eyes fixed on the immense prize of a Spanish galleon, not the paltry reward for ferrying supplies to a failed colony. White was essentially asking men to risk their lives and their fortunes for what many in power now considered a lost cause. The frustration must have been maddening. He possessed the knowledge and the will to act, but he was completely powerless, a single voice drowned out by the clamor of a nation fighting for its life. We can picture him standing on a crowded wharf, watching a mighty galleon set sail to join the fight against the Armada, its decks lined with cheering sailors. For everyone else, it was a moment of patriotic fervor. For White, it was another ship that couldn't carry him west, another delay stretching into an uncertain future. Each passing season was a death sentence he was forced to deliver from afar. He knew the math better than anyone. The supplies left on Roanoke were meant to last only until the spring of 1588. By the time the Spanish fleet was famously scattered by English fire ships and broken by the Protestant wind in the summer, the colonists would have already faced a hungry summer and a desperate autumn. After the victory, the obstacles did not vanish, they merely changed form. England was victorious but bankrupt, the Crown's coffers were empty, and the priority shifted to rebuilding the navy and securing the nation's finances. Raleigh's own attention and resources were stretched thin. White's mission was no longer competing with a military emergency, but with economic reality. His relentless petitions were now met with polite indifference or outright dismissal. The mood in England had shifted. The initial fervor for New World colonization had been tempered by Ralph Lane's reports of hardship and the immense cost of the war with Spain. To investors, Roanoke was beginning to look less like a promise of gold and more like a bottomless pit for money and lives. Yet White never gave up. His desperation evolved into a grim, dogged persistence. He became a fixture in the maritime circles of London, a familiar, pleading face that merchants began to recognize and perhaps avoid. He likely clung to one fragile hope, the contingency plan. In his mind, he would replay the agreement. If they left, they would carve a message. They would go 50 miles inland, or they would go south to CROATOAN, to Mantio's people. This logical plan was the thread he held onto, the story he told himself to keep the nightmare of their utter annihilation at bay. He wasn't just waiting to rescue them, he was waiting to find out where he needed to go to rescue them. This hope, however faint, was the only thing that sustained him through month after agonizing month of helpless inaction, a 3-year nightmare of imagined horrors and clinging to the faintest possibility of a miracle. Finally, in the summer of 1590, after 3 years of agonizing delay, John White managed to secure passage on a privateering vessel, its captain willing to make a brief stop at Roanoke on his way to richer plunder in the Caribbean. The journey was another trial, a tense and slow voyage that must have felt interminable to the anxious governor. When the dense green line of the Outer Banks finally appeared on the horizon in mid-August, the anticipation aboard that ship was palpable. White stood at the rail, scanning the shoreline for any sign of life, a column of smoke, the flutter of laundry on a line, the distant figure of a sentry. He saw nothing but the relentless, unchanging wall of trees. As their small boat approached the familiar shore, the first true chill of dread must have settled in his heart. There was no challenge from the fort, no welcoming party rushing to the beach. The only sound was the cry of gulls and the relentless wash of waves on the sand. The settlement was silent. Stepping onto the land he had left 3 years prior, White was met with a scene of profound and unsettling abandonment. The houses within the palisade were not burned or shattered by attack. They had been carefully and deliberately dismantled. The heavy timbers and planks were gone, systematically taken away, leaving only the empty outlines of their foundations being slowly reclaimed by weeds and creeping vines. It was a sight that spoke not of sudden violence, but of a methodical, organized departure. The fortifications, too, had been taken apart with purpose, the sharpened logs of the palisade removed, leaving behind a ghost of a footprint in the earth. The silence was the most oppressive part, a heavy blanket thrown over the entire island, broken only by the footsteps of the search party as they moved through the empty compound. They called out names into the stillness: Ananias, Elena, but the only answer was the rustle of leaves in the wind. There were no bodies, no graves, no signs of a struggle. No scattered belongings or evidence of a panicked flight. It was as if the entire community had simply packed up their most crucial possessions, took apart their homes to be rebuilt elsewhere, and walked away in good order. The absence of any indication of a fight was in its own way more terrifying than a battlefield would have been, because it offered no explanation, only a deeper, more confounding mystery. And then they found the clues. Carved into one of the few remaining wooden posts at the entrance to the abandoned fort was a single word: CROATOAN. It was cut cleanly and deeply into the wood, a clear and deliberate message. Eagerly, feverishly, White and the sailors searched the surrounding trees and posts for the one thing that would give this word its critical context: the Maltese cross, the agreed-upon sign that they had been forced to leave in distress. They scanned every surface, but the cross was nowhere to be found. Its absence was a message in itself. According to the very plan White himself had helped devise, the lack of the cross meant the move had been voluntary. They had not been under attack when they left, they had chosen to go, and the word pointed south toward the barrier island home of Mantio's people, the one place where they could have hoped for a friendly reception and the resources to survive. A surge of relief must have washed over John White. They had not been wiped out, they had relocated, they were alive, and he knew exactly where to find them. This single word, CROATOAN, carved into that post was not a random scrawl or a frantic last message. It was a calculated, purposeful piece of communication, a breadcrumb left behind for the one person they trusted would come looking for them. John White would have immediately recognized its profound significance. The spelling itself was a critical detail. The colonists didn't carve a vague or abbreviated clue. They used the full, formal name for the people and the place, CROATOAN. This was the precise term used in all their official discussions and maps, the name for Mantio's home and his tribe. It was a specific destination, not a panicked or confused notation. The most powerful piece of evidence, however, was what wasn't there. The absence of the Maltese cross was, in this context, louder than any symbol could have been. That cross was the agreed-upon signal for distress, the universal symbol that would have screamed, "We are under attack," or "We are being forced to flee." Its deliberate omission was a clear and intentional message. According to the very plan White had helped create, it meant the colonists had departed of their own volition and in relative safety. They weren't running for their lives, they were moving with a plan. This single detail transforms the entire scene from one of potential massacre to one of organized relocation. Further supporting this theory was the second, lesser-known carving found on a tree at the edge of the settlement, the letters CRO. This wasn't necessarily a separate, unfinished message. It could easily have been a marker, a simple directional signpost pointing the way for the main group as they began their journey, much like a hiker might notch a tree on a trail. Together, CRO and the full CROATOAN painted a picture of a community that was not in a blind panic, but was thinking clearly and leaving a coherent trail for their governor to follow. The logic behind this destination was overwhelming. Where else could they have gone? Their relationship with the mainland CROATOAN tribes, thanks to Ralph Lane's legacy of violence, was likely hostile or, at best, dangerously uncertain. To travel inland would have been to venture into completely unknown territory, risking encounters with potentially unwelcoming nations without a guide or an ally. The only friendly face they had in the entire region was Mantio. He had just been elevated to the status of a lord by the English themselves, a powerful gesture meant to cement an alliance. His people, the CROATOAN, were known to be prosperous hunters and fishermen, living on a barrier island rich in resources. They had the food stores and the knowledge to help over 100 people survive. For the starving, isolated colonists, the choice would have been obvious: seek sanctuary with their only confirmed ally in the New World. The carvings weren't a mystery to John White. They were the answer he most hoped to find, a clear directive pointing south to the one place where his family and his people could have possibly found salvation. Despite the overwhelming relief that must have flooded through him upon finding that carved word, the situation John White faced on that beach was far from simple. A logical destination was one thing, actually reaching it was another challenge entirely. The weather, which had always been a fickle and dangerous master in these waters, was already turning. The sky began to darken with the ominous bruised purple of an approaching hurricane, and the wind started to whip the sea into a churning, white-capped frenzy. These were the infamous storms of the Carolina coast, capable of shredding sails and driving even the most robust ships onto the treacherous, shifting sandbars known as the graveyard of the Atlantic. The captain of White's ship, a privateer with his eyes on Spanish gold and no personal stake in this colonial drama, took one look at the worsening conditions and made his priorities brutally clear. He declared that it was far too dangerous to attempt the short sail south to CROATOAN Island. To do so would risk his ship, his crew, and his entire lucrative voyage for what he likely saw as a fool's errand. The ship itself had also sustained damage during the Atlantic crossing, and the crew was growing increasingly restless and mutinous. They had signed on for plunder and profit, not for a risky rescue mission in the face of a deadly storm. Their reluctance was a powerful and practical obstacle. A ship's captain in that era ruled not by absolute decree but often by the consent of his men, especially on a privateering vessel where the crew shared in the spoils. Faced with a near certainty of shipwreck and a crew on the verge of outright refusal, the captain gave White an impossible ultimatum. They would leave now or they would all perish. The very elements that protected the Outer Banks from Spanish invasion were now conspiring to keep its final secret hidden. In that moment, standing on the shore as the wind howled around him, John White was forced to make the most heartbreaking decision of his life. He had to choose between an almost suicidal attempt to confirm the safety of his family or to preserve his own life and the testimony of what he had found, in the hope of leading a proper rescue later. With a heavy heart, he turned his back on the island and the carved clue, boarding the ship to sail back to England, the mystery still painfully unresolved. His return to England was not the end of his quest, but the beginning of a new kind of purgatory. He arrived more determined than ever to launch a proper expedition, one with a single purpose: to sail to CROATOAN Island and find his people. But the world had moved on. The glorious victory over the Spanish Armada had given way to a protracted war, and England's resources and attention were still stretched thin. Sir Walter Raleigh, his primary patron, had become distracted by other ventures and had also fallen out of favor at court, losing much of his influence and wealth. The romantic dream of a new world colony had been replaced by the hard, practical economics of privateering, which offered immediate and spectacular returns on investment. Funding a humanitarian mission to find a lost colony, one that had already consumed a fortune with no return, was a nearly impossible sell. White spent the remainder of his life petitioning anyone who would listen: wealthy merchants, other noblemen, even the new king, James I. He wrote frantic, pleading letters describing the carvings and his certainty that the colonists were alive and waiting on CROATOAN, but his desperate appeals fell on deaf ears. To the power brokers of England, Roanoke was no longer a priority. It was a costly failure, a lesson in what not to do. The colonial impulse had not died, but it had shifted. When England finally established its first permanent settlement at Jamestown in 1607, 20 years after the disappearance, the fate of the Roanoke colonists became a haunting footnote, a ghost story told by the founders to warn the new arrivals of the dangers that awaited them in the wilderness. The mystery of the 115 was simply buried under the pressing, immediate concerns of building a new colony, fighting disease and starvation, and negotiating with the powerful Powhatan Confederacy. John White, the man who knew the truth was within reach, died a broken man, his promise to his daughter unfulfilled, the single word, CROATOAN, the only epitaph for his family and his failed dream. For the next 2 decades, the fate of the Roanoke colonists became a subject of intense speculation and whispered legend back in England. But it was the establishment of Jamestown in 1607 that finally provided a new vantage point from which to search for answers. The men of this new, struggling settlement, led by the formidable Captain John Smith, arrived with the ghost of Roanoke hanging over them, a cautionary tale of failure. Yet almost immediately, they began to hear stories from their Powhatan allies and enemies that sent a shiver of recognition through the colony. These weren't just vague rumors, they were specific, persistent accounts that seemed to point toward the survival of at least some of the lost settlers. The most compelling reports came from Chief Powhatan himself, the powerful ruler of the region, who spoke to John Smith through the young translator Pocahontas. Powhatan claimed to have personally ordered the slaughter of the Roanoke colonists. He described them as a group of people who had been living with a Chesapeake tribe to the south, the very location John White had originally intended for his settlement. According to his grim account, his warriors had attacked and killed most of them, sparing only a handful of women and children who were then absorbed into his tribal confederacy. This story was both a warning and a boast, a demonstration of his power and a message to the new English arrivals about the consequences of crossing him. While it offered a tragic end, it also confirmed a crucial detail. The colonists had, at least for a time, survived and moved from Roanoke, but other, more hopeful whispers persisted. Jamestown settlers reported hearing from various native sources about groups of people who lived in towns to the south and west, people who built houses with walls, who dressed in European-style clothing, and who could apparently read from books. One particularly tantalizing account came from a young English boy named Henry Spellman, who lived among the Powhatan for a time. He reported meeting a native man who claimed to have been one of the Roanoke colonists, a story that, if true, would have been nothing short of miraculous. Even more intriguing were the reports of white Indians or natives with light-colored eyes, physical traits that suggested the possibility of intermarriage and assimilation rather than outright slaughter. Perhaps the most famous piece of evidence from this era is the strange story of the Newport stone. In 1608, Captain Christopher Newport, on an expedition up the James River, was reportedly led to a large rock by his native guide. On it, they claimed, was a carved message left by a group of people who had passed through years before. While the exact nature of this inscription was never clearly documented, the very existence of such a story within the Jamestown community indicates how deeply the idea of the lost colonists' survival had permeated their understanding of the land. These stories weren't treated as mere campfire tales. They were pursued as legitimate leads by men who were desperate to understand the forces at work in this new world and perhaps to find allies in their own desperate struggle for survival. For the Jamestown settlers, the mystery of Roanoke was not a closed chapter from the past, but an ongoing puzzle happening just beyond the edge of the known map, a lingering question mark that made the vast American wilderness feel even more mysterious and full of secrets. From the moment the settlement was found empty, one of the most immediate and terrifying theories was that of a violent end. It was, after all, the most logical fear for the English in a hostile new world. The Spanish Empire, England's bitter rival, had a well-established presence in La Florida, just to the south. They viewed any English settlement in the Americas as an illegal incursion, a nest of heretics and pirates that threatened their shipping lanes and their claim to the entire continent. We know for a fact they were actively hunting for it. Spanish archives from the period reveal that the governor of Florida had received intelligence about the Roanoke colony and had dispatched several reconnaissance missions to locate and assess this English threat. In 1588, a captain named Vicente Gonzalez even managed to sail into the Outer Banks, but he found the area deserted and reported seeing no signs of the settlement. The Spanish were indeed searching, but the historical record is clear. They never found the colony to attack it. This official documentation effectively rules out a Spanish massacre, transforming their role from prime suspects into a group of equally frustrated searchers, a fascinating twist in the geopolitical drama of the era. If not the Spanish, then perhaps the threat came from closer to home. The English had, through Ralph Lane's brutal actions, made powerful enemies among the mainland Secotán people. The memory of Lane's attack on Desman-Kepuk and the murder of their leader, Wingina, would have been a fresh and powerful motive for revenge. A coordinated assault by a coalition of Secotán warriors was a very real possibility in the minds of the colonists and of those back in England who heard the news. This theory of a native attack was reinforced decades later by the accounts from Jamestown, particularly the story attributed to Chief Powhatan himself, claiming he had ordered the colonists killed. This narrative of a massacre fit the prevailing European worldview of the time, which often cast indigenous peoples as savage and untrustworthy. It was a simple, horrifying, and tragically common explanation for a disappearance in the wilderness. However, this theory begins to unravel under closer examination, particularly in light of the evidence found at the site. a large-scale attack would have left clear signs, evidence of burning, broken weapons, and most tellingly, human remains. Yet John White and the Jamestown settlers who later investigated found no such evidence. The scene was one of orderly dismantlement, not destruction. Furthermore, the very act of carving the word CROATOAN without the distress cross suggests the colonists had enough time and peace to leave a calm, deliberate message. If a war party was descending upon them, it is highly unlikely they would have paused to carefully carve a destination into a post. The absence of the cross is a powerful argument against an attack happening at the fort itself. While conflict with a hostile tribe remains a possibility for what happened to the colonists after they left Roanoke, the evidence on the island itself points away from a violent end at their home base. The silence of the abandoned settlement speaks louder than the rumors of battle, whispering not of a sudden, brutal conclusion, but of a deliberate and planned departure into an uncertain future. But the story of Roanoke did not simply fade into the dusty pages of history books to be studied by academics. Instead, it escaped into the fertile soil of the American imagination, transforming from a historical cold case into a powerful, enduring national myth. The single word, CROATOAN, became a blank canvas upon which each generation could project its own fears, hopes, and questions about the nation's origins. No single figure embodies this transformation more than Virginia Dare. That first English child born in the New World ceased to be just a historical footnote and was reborn as a potent symbol. In the 19th century, as the young United States was consciously forging its own identity and seeking foundational stories to rival the ancient myths of Europe, the tale of the lost colony was rediscovered and passionately romanticized. Virginia Dare, in particular, was lifted from the historical record and transformed into an almost mythical figure. She became the perfect protagonist for a new American folklore, an innocent, white, English maiden born into a pristine wilderness, her fate a haunting question mark at the very beginning of the national story. Poets and novelists seized upon her image. She was depicted in countless works of art and literature, not as an infant who likely perished, but as a beautiful young woman who grew up among the native tribes, a tragic princess caught between two worlds. In one popular and enduring legend, she was transformed into a white doe by the jealous magic of a medicine man, forever roaming the forests of North Carolina, a pure spirit of the land forever just out of reach. This romanticized version served a specific cultural need. It provided an origin story that was both distinctly American and poignantly tragic, a tale of innocence lost that resonated deeply with a nation still reconciling its colonial past with its wilderness origins. This 19th century revival was fueled by more than just artistic fancy. It was part of a broader national movement to create a uniquely American history, one that stretched back before the Revolution to lend an air of antiquity to the new republic. The mystery of Roanoke was perfect for this purpose. It was ancient, it was unsolved, and it was entirely American. This fervor inevitably led to a wave of sensational and almost entirely fraudulent claims from individuals eager to provide a definitive answer. The most famous of these hoaxes was the discovery of the so-called Dare Stones. Beginning in 1937, a series of carved rocks surfaced, supposedly telling a dramatic story of the colonists' journey inland and the death of many, including Elena Dare, Virginia's mother. The inscriptions were detailed and emotionally charged, and for a short time they captivated the public and even convinced some scholars. It was later revealed to be an elaborate forgery, a scam perpetrated by a frustrated stonecutter seeking fame and fortune. Yet the very existence of such an elaborate hoax speaks to the powerful grip the story held on the popular consciousness. People weren't just curious about the answer, they were emotionally invested in the narrative. The lost colony became a Rorschach test for American identity. For some, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of the unknown wilderness. For others, it was a story of assimilation and the hopeful blending of cultures. For still others, it was a foundational ghost story, a national tragedy that gave the land itself a sense of haunted history. This elevation from historical event to cultural legend ensured that the search for answers would never truly end, driven not just by academic curiosity, but by a deep, almost mythological need to solve the very first mystery of America's birth. For centuries, the only evidence from Roanoke Island was the silent, sandy soil and the written accounts of those who had come before. The mystery lived entirely in libraries and legends until a new wave of seekers arrived, not with ships and sails, but with shovels and a burning desire to dig up the truth. The birth of archaeology as a modern discipline in the late 19th century finally offered a way to move beyond speculation and physically interrogate the ground where the colonists had once lived. This shift from romantic pondering to physical excavation began not with academics, but with a passionate and somewhat eccentric group of individuals driven by a potent mix of historical curiosity and pure treasure hunting ambition. The story of Roanoke's archaeology starts not with a university grant, but with a determined few who were captivated by the legend. In the 1890s, a man named Talcott Williams, a journalist and avid history buff, became obsessed with finding the physical location of the famous lost fort. He pored over John White's original maps and descriptions, comparing them to the modern landscape of the island. His efforts culminated in a significant, though frustrating, discovery. He believed he had found the site of the earthwork fort, but the evidence was largely based on topography and a few scattered artifacts, enough to point the way but not enough to prove it conclusively. His work, however, lit a fuse. It demonstrated that the answers might not be lost to time, but simply waiting beneath the surface. This initial spark was fanned into a flame by one of America's most famous tycoons. In the 1930s, the mystery captured the imagination of Paul Green, a Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright who reached out to an unlikely partner, the automaker Henry Ford. Green was determined to create an outdoor theatrical spectacle, what we now call the Lost Colony drama, to tell the story on the very ground where it happened. To make this dream a reality, he needed to know exactly where to build his theater. He convinced Ford, a man known for his interest in American history and preservation, to fund a major archaeological expedition to definitively locate Fort Raleigh. Ford's money brought in professional archaeologists, most notably J.C. Harrington, a young historian who would become a pivotal figure in the field of historical archaeology. Harrington's dig in 1947 and 1948 was a turning point. This was no longer a treasure hunt, it was a meticulous scientific process. His team excavated the site Williams had identified decades prior, and what they found was both electrifying and enigmatic. They uncovered the distinct, faint outline of a small, star-shaped fort. This was not a massive military citadel, it was a small outpost, its dimensions matching exactly the descriptions from Ralph Lane's era. They found a gun platform, a smithy where metal had been worked, and a handful of tantalizing artifacts, a single gun barrel, fragments of Indian pottery, and a few English coins. For the first time, there was physical, tangible proof that the English had been right there. The fort was real, yet in classic Roanoke fashion, this discovery solved one small mystery only to deepen the larger one. Harrington's excavation confirmed the location of the 1585 military garrison, but it revealed almost nothing about the 1587 colony of families. The artifacts were sparse, belonging to soldiers, not to the men, women, and children who vanished. There were no personal items, no remains of the houses they built, no clues to their fate. The archaeology of the fort, while historically vital, hit a hard stop. It was as if the ground itself had swallowed the civilian settlement whole, leaving behind only the martial skeleton of Lane's failed occupation. This frustrating lack of evidence for the lost colony itself forced a difficult realization. If the answers were to be found, archaeologists would have to stop looking solely at the fort and start searching the entire island and beyond, a monumental task that would require new technologies and a completely new way of thinking. The early digs had successfully found the prologue to the story, but the final, heartbreaking chapter remained stubbornly buried, its secrets guarded by centuries of sand, silence, and the relentless growth of the live oaks. The frustrating dead end at the fort site forced a profound shift in strategy. Archaeologists realized that if the civilian settlement wasn't inside the earthworks, it could be anywhere on the island or even beyond its shores. The old method, digging test pits based on hunches, was like searching for a needle in a haystack with a teaspoon. The hunt for the lost colony needed a technological leap, a way to see through time and soil without ever lifting a shovel. This is where late 20th and 21st century science truly revolutionized the investigation, transforming archaeology from a speculative treasure hunt into a precise, data-driven field of discovery. The first major breakthrough came from looking at the very ground beneath their feet in an entirely new light. Soil chemistry analysis, or geochemical surveying, is based on a simple but powerful principle: human activity leaves an invisible fingerprint. Where people live, cook, work, and discard their waste, they dramatically alter the chemical composition of the soil. Centuries of organic matter, food scraps, decaying wooden posts, hearth ashes, and even the phosphorus from human and animal waste create concentrated chemical signatures that can persist for hundreds of years. Modern archaeologists systematically grid an area and take hundreds of small soil core samples, which are then analyzed in a lab. A map emerges from this data, not of objects but of human presence itself. A sudden spike in phosphorus levels might outline the precise footprint of a long-vanished trash midden, while areas rich in organic matter could pinpoint the location of a house, its wooden posts having rotted away and enriched the soil. This technique allows researchers to literally map out an entire settlement's layout, its houses, workspaces, and pathways based on nothing but the chemical ghost it left behind, guiding excavators directly to the most promising spots and saving years of fruitless digging. To peer even deeper without disturbing a single grain of sand, researchers turn to ground-penetrating radar, or GPR. This remarkable technology works like sonar for the Earth, sending high-frequency radio waves into the ground and measuring the signals that bounce back. Different materials, solid rock, loose soil, a buried post hole, or a brick hearth, reflect these waves differently. A skilled operator towing a GPR unit over a field can build a three-dimensional picture of what lies beneath, revealing the subtle disturbances that signal human activity. For the search on Roanoke, GPR became an indispensable tool. It could identify the faint outlines of palisade walls, the rectangular patterns of building foundations, or the telltale pits of storage cellars, all hidden just feet below the surface. It allowed teams to survey large swaths of the island quickly and non-invasively, ruling out empty areas and focusing their efforts on the most archaeologically promising anomalies. It was the ultimate way to separate signal from noise in a landscape that had been continuously altered by 4 centuries of nature and later human habitation. Perhaps the most dramatic technological advancement has been the arrival of LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging. This technology, often deployed from aircraft, uses laser pulses to meticulously map the surface of the Earth, and its magic lies in its ability to digitally strip away the modern vegetation, the dense forests and undergrowth that have covered the island since the colonists' time. What remains is a stunningly detailed, bare Earth digital model of the terrain, revealing micro-topography invisible to the naked eye. On LiDAR maps, the slightest humps and depressions suddenly tell a story. The long, straight, subtle ridge of an eroded fortification wall, the sunken track of a centuries-old path, or the perfect rectangular depression of a cellar can leap off the screen. LiDAR doesn't just look at the ground, it recreates the historical landscape itself, allowing archaeologists to see the island almost as John White saw it, and to identify features that have been smoothed over by time but never completely erased. These high-tech tools are ultimately in service of a more disciplined and systematic approach to surveying. Modern teams no longer focus on a single magic spot. Instead, they conduct broad, methodical pedestrian surveys, walking straight-line transects across vast areas of the island and the surrounding mainland, their eyes trained to spot the smallest artifacts, a shard of European pottery, a flint chip from gunflint production, or a glass bead, that could point to a broader settlement. This marriage of old-school field walking with cutting-edge technology creates a powerful multi-layered investigation. LiDAR and GPR identify the large-scale features and areas of interest. Soil chemistry confirms the presence of intense human activity, and systematic surveying finds the physical proof on the surface. Together, they form an investigative tapestry, allowing researchers to cover more ground with greater precision than ever before, not to find a single DRAM a TIC Chinese letter, but to slowly, painstakingly, and scientifically piece together the final movements of the lost colonists from the silent, enduring clues they left in the earth. The official Fort Raleigh National Historic Site stands today as a carefully preserved monument to the mystery, a place where generations of archaeologists have patiently sifted through the sandy soil, hoping to find the answers John White could not. Their work began in earnest in the 1940s, led by the pioneering efforts of J.C. Harrington. His team's most significant discovery was a series of faint, dark stains in the earth, the ghostly impressions of post holes. These weren't random disturbances, they formed a distinct geometric pattern, the unmistakable outline of a small, star-shaped fortification. This was the physical proof of the garrison led by Ralph Lane, its dimensions perfectly matching the descriptions from the 1585 expedition. The Earth had finally given up one of its secrets. Beyond the fort's footprint, the excavations yielded a small but telling collection of European artifacts, each one a silent witness to the English presence. They uncovered fragments of coarse border-ware pottery, a common type of English utilitarian ceramic used for storage and cooking. They found pieces of crucibles and slag, evidence of a blacksmith's forge where metal was worked and repaired. A few shards of fine German Bartmann jugs, also known as bellarmines, hinted at the possessions of an officer or a gentleman, a touch of refined life in the rugged wilderness. Most evocative of all was a small, worn token called a Nuremberg jeton, a counting token used on a reckoning board, a tiny piece of a financier's world that had somehow found its way to this remote shore. Each of these objects is a data point, confirming the historical record and placing Englishmen of the late 16th century squarely on that piece of ground. Yet for all these fascinating finds, the site has been stubbornly, almost defiantly, silent on the very question that draws everyone there: what happened to the civilians? The artifacts all belong to the military occupation of 1585 to 1586. There is a complete absence of evidence for the civilian colony of 1587. We have found nothing belonging to the women or the children. No toys, no thimbles, no distinctive personal items that would speak to a community of families trying to build a permanent home. This frustrating void is the central paradox of Fort Raleigh archaeology. We have confirmed the prologue to the story, but the final, heartbreaking chapter has left no trace in that specific location. There are compelling reasons why the site itself may never yield conclusive proof about the colonists' fate. The first is simple logistics. The civilian settlement was almost certainly not confined within the small, military-style fort. John White's map suggests the houses for the families were built outside the earthworks in a separate village. This area has been dramatically altered over the past 4 centuries by erosion, later settlement, and even the construction of the waterside theater for the lost colony drama. The ground where those civilian homes once stood may have long since washed into the Sound or been fundamentally disturbed by subsequent activity, effectively erasing the most crucial evidence. Furthermore, the nature of their departure works against the archaeologist's trowel. The evidence suggests they did not flee in a panic. They deliberately and carefully dismantled their homes, taking the valuable lumber and their most important possessions with them. They were not overrun at their hearths. They packed up and left. A community that leaves in an orderly fashion, taking their belongings, inherently leaves behind very little for future excavators to find. They cleaned up after themselves, leaving only the stains of their post holes and the scraps they deemed worthless. The most conclusive answers were never going to be found inside the fort's walls. They were carried away with the colonists themselves, scattered along the trail they took into the unknown, waiting to be discovered not on Roanoke Island but somewhere else entirely. This search for answers beyond the fort's silent earth has led archaeologists to follow the colonists' own clues, sailing south to the very place they indicated, CROATOAN, known today as Hatteras Island. It is here that one of the most compelling chapters in the modern investigation has unfolded, spearheaded by the persistent work of British archaeologist Dr. Mark Horton and his team. For over a decade, they have conducted meticulous excavations on Hatteras, not looking for a lost city, but for the subtle, everyday evidence that would prove the two cultures came together. Their findings have been nothing short of revolutionary, providing the first significant physical evidence that the integration theory might be more than just a hopeful story. What they have unearthed is a fascinating collection of objects that tell a story of contact and blending. We're not talking about a random coin washed up on a beach. These are personal, intimate items found precisely where a blended community would have lived. Among the most dramatic finds are pieces of a rapier hilt, the elegant handguard of a gentleman's dueling sword, an object that has no practical purpose for hunting or survival, but immense value as a status symbol or trade item. They found parts of a gun, specifically the metal firing mechanism from an early musket known as a snaffons, which would have been technologically advanced and highly prized equipment for the English. Perhaps most poignant are the small, personal effects. A delicate aglet of gold that once tightened a wealthy Elizabethan's clothing, a twisted wire ring that is unmistakably Elizabethan in its craftsmanship, and fragments of writing slates, the small blackboards children and adults used for practice and notes, complete of course with a piece of slate pencil. The context of these discoveries is absolutely critical. These European objects weren't found in a hidden English chest or a lone grave. They were excavated from within the soil of a traditional CROATOAN village site, thoroughly mixed with the everyday debris of native life, pottery shards, animal bones from meals, and stone tools. This isn't evidence of a battle where trophies were taken, it's evidence of a community. A rapier hilt might be a war prize, but a twisted wire ring or a writing slate is not. These are the kinds of objects that are kept, used, and ultimately lost or discarded over a lifetime. The writing slate fragment is particularly telling, as it suggests not just cohabitation, but the potential transfer of knowledge, an attempt to teach or learn, a powerful gesture of cultural exchange. For many, this assemblage of artifacts is the smoking gun. It seems to perfectly corroborate the integration theory, painting a picture of the colonists splitting into smaller groups, traveling south to their only known allies, and gradually being absorbed into the CROATOAN community through marriage and mutual dependence. They would have traded their advanced metal tools and weapons for food and security, their personal belongings becoming part of the native material culture over generations. The evidence on Hatteras Island strongly suggests that at least a significant portion of the lost colony didn't vanish. They simply went home with their friend Manteo and became part of a new, blended society. However, in the world of archaeology, every compelling theory faces rigorous scrutiny, and the Hatteras evidence is no exception. Some scholars urge caution, pointing out legitimate questions that remain unanswered. The primary issue is one of precise dating. While the artifacts are undoubtedly Elizabethan, the soil layers on barrier islands like Hatteras are incredibly dynamic, churned by storms, wind, and human activity over centuries. Without an unbroken, datable context like finding a ring sealed beneath a hearth that can be carbon dated, it is difficult to prove with 100% certainty that these objects arrived with the lost colonists in 1587. They could theoretically have come from later trade with the Jamestown settlers after 1607, or even from shipwrecks, as the graveyard of the Atlantic has claimed countless vessels along that coast. This skepticism isn't about dismissing the findings, it's about the scientific demand for irrefutable proof. The dream find would be something that definitively links an artifact to a specific Roanoke colonist, an object engraved with a name like Ananias Dare, or a date stone from the 1580s found in a secure archaeological context. Until such a discovery is made, the wonderfully evocative evidence from Hatteras Island remains powerfully suggestive, but not quite the final word. It points overwhelmingly toward integration and survival, offering the most satisfying and evidence-backed answer we have, yet it still holds onto just enough mystery to keep the search and the debate very much alive. While the evidence from Hatteras Island paints a compelling picture of a southern migration, it doesn't tell the whole story. The single word, CROATOAN, might have been a clear directive for the main group, but the contingencies discussed likely accounted for other possibilities. This leads us to the mainland theory, a parallel narrative suggesting the colonists may have split into smaller groups, with some deciding to travel west, away from the vulnerable coast and into the dense, mysterious interior surrounding the Albemarle Sound. This idea transforms the mystery from a single vanishing act into a potential diaspora, a scattering of survivors seeking different paths to salvation. For decades, this theory was largely speculative, based on little more than the logical notion that putting distance between themselves and the coast would offer protection from both Spanish raiders and any remaining hostile CROATOAN groups. The sheer size and unknown nature of the interior would have been terrifying, but it also represented possibility: unclaimed land, new rivers for fishing, and potentially more welcoming native communities deeper inland. The hope for finding this physical evidence seemed like a long shot until a remarkable discovery shifted the entire landscape of the search. The key to unlocking this part of the puzzle wasn't found with a shovel in the ground, but with a fresh pair of eyes on a 400-year-old map. In 2012, researchers at the First Colony Foundation were conducting a routine analysis of John White's original watercolor map of the region, held by the British Museum. Using high-tech hyperspectral imaging to look beneath the surface of the parchment, they made an electrifying discovery. In what is now modern-day Bertie County, North Carolina, near the head of the Albemarle Sound, two faint, careful patches were detected. These weren't smudges or mistakes, they were deliberate corrections made by the mapmaker, and hidden beneath one of these patches was a meticulously drawn symbol, a stout, star-shaped fort. This secret fort, sketched in invisible ink or a since-faded pigment, was located a full 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island. The English had a name for such a secondary fallback position. It was called a Site X. This cartographic revelation was a game-changer. It suggested that the plan all along, known perhaps only to the leadership like John White, was not to remain permanently on the exposed coast. The ultimate goal was always to move inland to a more secure and resource-rich location. This hidden symbol on the map provided a specific, logical destination for a potential splinter group. It gave archaeologists a precise place to look, transforming a vast, unknown territory into a focused search grid. The hunt for proof was now on. The site near present-day Edenton, North Carolina, quickly became the focus of intense archaeological investigation. And almost immediately, the ground began to yield its secrets. The team from the First Colony Foundation began unearthing a stunning array of European artifacts from the late 16th century, all found in a context that pointed to trade and cohabitation rather than conflict. They discovered fragments of border-ware pottery, the exact same type of utilitarian ceramic found at the Fort Raleigh site on Roanoke, used for storage and cooking. This wasn't just any old European pottery, it was the specific household where the colonists would have brought with them. Even more telling were the weapons-related finds. They uncovered pieces of a gun barrel, fragments of lead shot, and a single copper aglet, a tiny tip from a lace that would have been used to fasten Elizabethan clothing. Most dramatically, they found a single piece of a rapier hilt, a finely made object that signifies the presence of a gentleman, someone of status who would have owned such a weapon. These weren't items that would have been casually traded far inland by later Jamestown settlers. They were personal, military, and domestic objects from the correct time period, found miles from the coast. The context of these discoveries is what makes them so powerful. These Elizabethan artifacts weren't found in isolation. They were excavated from what was clearly a native village site of the Algonquian-speaking people who lived in the area, likely the Weepameok or Roanoke tribes. The European objects were mixed seamlessly with local Indian pottery, stone tools, and food remains. This pattern suggests a prolonged, peaceful interaction. It points to a scenario where a small group of English colonists, perhaps following the secret plan indicated on White's map, traveled inland and were gradually integrated into a local native community. They would have traded their valuable metal tools, weapons, and knowledge for food, shelter, and protection, their belongings slowly becoming part of the village material culture over time. The mainland theory and the evidence from Site X don't necessarily negate the CROATOAN evidence. Instead, they add a fascinating layer of complexity to the story. It is entirely plausible that the colonists did not all agree on a single course of action. Facing an uncertain future, they may have split into two or more groups to increase their overall chances of survival. One group, likely the majority, may have heeded the message and traveled south to their known allies on CROATOAN. Another, smaller group, perhaps privy to the secret plan on White's map or simply more daring, could have chosen to strike out west into the unknown interior, hoping to find a new home far from the troubles of the coast. This interpretation transforms the tragedy of Roanoke from a simple tale of disappearance into a more nuanced story of resilience, adaptation, and the incredible lengths people will go to in order to survive. The lost colony may not have vanished so much as it simply dissolved, its people blending into the very fabric of the land they had hoped to conquer, leaving behind only scattered artifacts and a mystery that continues to captivate us centuries later. But if the social and political landscape was fraught with danger, the environmental reality may have been even more desperate, creating a pressure cooker from which the colonists had to escape. For centuries, the prevailing theories focused on human conflict or migration, but a groundbreaking scientific discovery in the late 1990s added a startling new layer of understanding, one that came not from a dusty archive, but from the silent, ancient rings of a bald cypress tree. The science of dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, allows researchers to read the history of climate like a book, with each ring representing a single year's growth. Wide rings indicate wet, prosperous years ideal for growth, while narrow, tightly packed rings tell a story of drought and struggle. By taking core samples from ancient trees and even submerged logs preserved in riverbeds, scientists can create a precise year-by-year chronology of moisture levels stretching back over a millennium. When researchers from the University of Arkansas analyzed tree ring data from southern Virginia and North Carolina, they made a chilling discovery. The data revealed that the entire period of English attempts to colonize Roanoke from 1587 through 1590 coincided with the most severe and sustained drought the region had experienced in 800 years. This wasn't just a few dry seasons, it was a catastrophic ecological event. The rings from those years are shockingly narrow, indicating a profound lack of rainfall that would have crippled any agricultural society. For the CROATOAN people, this drought would have been an immense challenge, testing their sophisticated food storage systems and deep knowledge of the land. But for the English colonists who arrived too late to plant their own crops and were entirely dependent on the generosity of the environment and the local tribes, it would have been a death sentence. Imagine the scene on Roanoke Island during that time. The summer sun would have been unrelenting, baking the already sandy soil into a hard pan. The fresh water streams and springs they relied on would have shrunk to muddy trickles, then vanished entirely. The corn crops they desperately tried to cultivate would have withered in the fields, their leaves curling and turning brown long before the ears could form. The forest, usually a source of game, would have grown quiet as animals migrated in search of water or perished. The very air would have been thick with dust and despair. This environmental catastrophe explains the sheer desperation in the colonists' decision to send John White back to England. Their supplies weren't just low, they were facing a complete ecological collapse. This climate data doesn't replace the other theories, it supercharges them. The drought acts as a powerful catalyst, exacerbating every single point of tension. It explains why the CROATOAN, who had initially been portrayed as generous, became reluctant to trade. They were facing their own life or death struggle for survival, watching their own carefully managed food stores dwindle under the stress of the drought. Their hesitation to share their precious remaining corn with the newcomers would not have been an act of hostility, but one of pure self-preservation. The English, misunderstanding this context, would have seen it as a betrayal, fueling the paranoia and conflict that Ralph Lane had instigated years before. The drought theory transforms the colonists' departure from a simple relocation into a forced evacuation. They weren't just moving to a better location, they were fleeing a dying land. The orderly dismantling of their homes makes perfect sense in this light. They weren't just leaving. They were moving everything of value because they knew they could not return to a place without water. The message CROATOAN carved on the post takes on a new, urgent meaning. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a survival strategy. CROATOAN, as a barrier island, would have had one critical advantage over Roanoke: access to fresh water from large, shallow aquifers and rainfall collected in freshwater ponds. For a group dying of thirst, it would have been the closest and most logical refuge. The drought provides the MISSING Chinese letter, the overwhelming environmental push that forced a community of over 100 people to make a desperate gamble and vanish into the wilderness, not as a matter of choice, but as their only remaining hope for survival. Yet for all the promise of modern science and systematic archaeology, the story of the lost colony has also been shaped by a far more human impulse, the desire for a quick and dramatic answer, no matter how dubious its origins. No episode exemplifies this better than the strange and sensational saga of the Dare Stones, a series of artifacts that captivated the American public and nearly rewrote the history of Roanoke in the 1930s with a tale of unparalleled hardship and survival. It all began in 1937, at the height of the Great Depression, when a California tourist named Louis Hammond drove into the small town of Edenton, North Carolina. He claimed to have been exploring a swamp along the Chowan River when he stumbled upon a large, heavy stone. It wasn't a natural rock, it was covered in strange, carved markings. He sold it to a local resident for what was then the princely sum of $1, setting in motion one of the most audacious historical hoaxes of the 20th century. The stone eventually made its way to Emory University in Atlanta, landing on the desk of a history professor named Haywood Pierce Jr. The inscription, though crude and difficult to decipher, told a harrowing story. It appeared to be a message from none other than Elena Dare, the daughter of John White and mother of Virginia Dare. The carving stated that the colonists had fled Roanoke Island after an attack by savages that left most of them dead, including her husband Ananias. She and a small group of survivors, including her young daughter, were now captives. The message ended with a plea and a date, 1591. If genuine, this was the very first and only direct communication from the lost colonists, a heartbreaking epilogue carved in stone. The academic world was initially electrified. Here, seemingly, was the answer they had been seeking for centuries. The excitement only grew as more stones began to appear. Over the next 3 years, nearly 4 dozen additional engraved rocks surfaced, almost all brought forward by a man named Bill Eberhart, a stonecutter from Fulton County, Georgia. These subsequent stones elaborated on the story in incredible detail, creating a sprawling narrative of the colonists' desperate journey inland. They told of Elena Dare's continued suffering, the death of her daughter Virginia, and the group's wanderings through the Carolinas and as far west as Georgia. The inscriptions were filled with specific dates, biblical references, and an increasingly elaborate, almost novelistic account of their trials. The public, hungry for a resolution to the mystery, was utterly enthralled. Newspapers across the country splashed the story on their front pages, and for a brief moment, it seemed the greatest American historical puzzle had been solved not by a scholar in a library, but by a tourist in a swamp. The initial academic fervor, however, soon gave way to deep and well-founded suspicion. Linguists and historians began to pick apart the inscriptions. The language used was riddled with anachronisms and phrases that no Elizabethan English person would have used. The spelling was inconsistent and often modern. The carving style itself was wrong. The letters were cut with the precise, machine-like efficiency of modern tools, not the hand-wrought, uneven strokes of someone using a 16th-century chisel. Most damning of all was the sheer convenience of it all. The stones appeared precisely when a charismatic showman, a former Shakespearean actor turned Brenow College administrator named Haywood Pierce SR, father of the Emory professor, was actively touring the country giving lectures on the lost colony and offering a cash reward for any artifacts related to it. Eberhart, the stonecutter, had attended one of these very lectures just before finding the majority of the stones. The hoax was finally exposed in 1940 by a journalist from the Saturday Evening Post named Boyden Sparks. Through diligent investigative work, Sparks tracked down Bill Eberhart and confronted him with overwhelming evidence. Under pressure, Eberhart confessed. He revealed how he had crafted the stones in his workshop using modern engraving tools, often consulting a dictionary for archaic-sounding words. He described how he would weather the stones by burning them in his furnace and cracking them with a hammer to make them look ancient, then plant them in remote locations for others to discover. His motive was simple: the cash reward and the fleeting fame. The entire elaborate narrative, from Elena's capture to Virginia's death, was a complete fabrication, a story woven to satisfy public craving and make a quick profit. The academic community, thoroughly embarrassed, universally dismissed the entire collection as a fraud. Yet, even after the confession, a sliver of mystery stubbornly remained. The very first stone, the one found by Louis Hammond back in 1937, was never definitively proven to be a fake. Eberhart denied creating this initial artifact, and some noted differences in its style and weathering compared to the later forgeries. A few modern researchers, including a geologist from the University of North Carolina, have argued that its inscription appears older and more weathered than Eberhart's admitted hoaxes. This has led to speculation that Hammond may have found a genuine, pre-existing engraved stone that Eberhart then used as the inspiration for his entire scheme. While the vast majority of historians dismiss even this first stone due to its stylistic and linguistic problems, its ambiguous status has been enough to fuel continued fascination in some corners of the internet and popular history. The legacy of the Dare stones is a cautionary tale about the powerful intersection of history, mystery, and human desire. They represent a path not taken in the search for the colonists, a detour into fantasy that ultimately distracted from the more painstaking work of real archaeology. Historians dismiss them because they were created not to illuminate the past, but to exploit the emotions of the present. They stand as a reminder that the truth about Roanoke is unlikely to be found in a single dramatic revelation, but will instead be slowly and patiently unearthed, one shard of pottery, one soil sample, and one tree ring at a time, through the meticulous and unglamorous work of science. While the shovels of archaeologists and the high-tech eyes of Lydia have been searching the earth for answers, a far more intimate search has been underway, one that looks for clues not in the soil, but in the very bloodlines of the people living in the region today. The emergence of modern genetic science has opened up a breathtaking new frontier in the search for the lost colonists, the possibility of finding their biological descendants. The premise is as simple as it is powerful. If a significant number of the Roanoke settlers survived and were absorbed into local Native American communities, as the archaeological evidence from Hatteras and the mainland suggests, then they would have left a genetic legacy. Their DNA would have been passed down through generations, and with today's technology, we might just be able to find it. This isn't about digging up artifacts, it's about sequencing the human genome to find a living connection to one of history's greatest mysteries. The most ambitious effort to date is the Lost Colony DNA project, initiated over a decade ago. The goal was to create a database of DNA samples from potential descendants, both from families with long oral histories linking them to the colonists and from members of modern Native American tribes in the region, such as the Lumbee and the Coharie. The idea was to look for rare genetic markers, specifically on the Y chromosome for male lines and mitochondrial DNA for female lines, that are unique to Western European populations and that could not be explained by later colonial intermarriage after Jamestown. Finding such a marker in a person with deep roots in the area would be a stunning piece of evidence, a biological breadcrumb leading straight back to the 16th century. The potential for a definitive answer has captivated both historians and the public, offering a seemingly clear and scientific path to closing the case. However, this scientific promise immediately crashes into a wall of immense practical and ethical challenges. The first is the sheer difficulty of the genetic search itself. We are attempting to find a signal that is over 400 years old from a group of just 115 people within a massive and constantly mixing gene pool. Think of it like trying to find a single, specific drop of ink that fell into a lake 4 centuries ago. The lake has been fed by countless rivers and streams of subsequent migration ever since. The arrival of tens of thousands of English, Scottish, and Irish settlers in the following centuries flooded the region with European DNA, making it nearly impossible to distinguish a genetic signature from 1587 from one that arrived in 1687. The DNA of any potential Roanoke descendant would be an incredibly faint whisper, almost completely drowned out by the genetic noise of later history. This leads to the second and far more profound challenge, the ethical minefield of asking Native American communities to participate in this research. For many tribal nations, the very question at the heart of the DNA project is offensive. Their oral histories and cultural identities are rich and complete. They know who they are and where they come from. The suggestion that their identity might need to be validated or explained by European DNA can feel like a form of scientific colonialism, an implication that their own history is incomplete until it is confirmed by Western technology. Furthermore, there is a deep and well-founded mistrust of outside researchers, particularly geneticists, who have a history of extracting biological data from indigenous communities without their full, informed consent and without providing any tangible benefit in return. Many tribes have strict policies against genetic testing, viewing DNA not as a simple tool for curiosity, but as a sacred part of their being that is not to be commodified or exploited for academic projects. Even within communities that are open to the idea, the process is fraught with complexity. The Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, for instance, has a long-standing oral tradition that speaks of ancestors speaking the talk of a foreign nation and having gray eyes, which some have interpreted as a possible link to the lost colonists. Some Lumbees have indeed participated in genetic studies, and certain family lineages have been found to carry rare European genetic markers that date back to the correct time period. Researchers point to this as promising, albeit not conclusive, evidence, but for the tribe itself, the interpretation of this data is a delicate matter. It risks reducing their complex and proud identity to a single historical event, potentially overshadowing thousands of years of distinct indigenous history that predates the English arrival. A positive result wouldn't just solve a mystery, it could fundamentally challenge, for better or worse, how a community understands itself. This tension between historical curiosity and cultural respect defines the modern genetic search. The scientific desire for an answer must be balanced against the right of a people to control their own narrative and their own biological data. The most ethical approach, which some researchers are now championing, is one of true partnership. This means that any genetic study must be led by the questions and concerns of the tribal communities themselves, not by outside academics. It requires informed consent that is truly informed, explaining not just the potential benefits but also the risks, including the possibility of uncovering painful or disruptive histories. And crucially, it must guarantee that the community retains control over the data and how it is used, ensuring that they are the primary beneficiaries of any knowledge gained. The quest to find the lost colonists through DNA is a powerful reminder that some mysteries are not just puzzles to be solved, but are deeply woven into the living fabric of people's lives. A genetic test might one day provide a stunning, headline-grabbing answer, identifying a direct descendant of Ananias Dare or Elena White. But even that discovery would be just the beginning of a much larger and more complex conversation about what that truth means, who gets to tell the story, and how we honor the countless, intertwined journeys of survival that have shaped the world we live in today. The DNA may hold a key, but it cannot unlock the mystery without also unlocking a profound responsibility to listen, to respect, and to understand the human stories behind the science. What is it about this 400-year-old cold case that refuses to let us go? Why does the story of a small, failed settlement on a remote island continue to echo so powerfully in our national consciousness? The enduring fascination with the Roanoke colony isn't just about historical curiosity. It taps into something much deeper within our collective psyche, a blend of primal fear, human drama, and the very nature of mystery itself. At its core, the power of this story lies in its absolute and utter silence. A complete community of men, women, and children didn't just die, they vanished. There is no battle site to memorialize, no mass grave to mourn, no conclusive evidence of any kind to provide closure. This total absence of an ending creates a vacuum, and nature, like our own minds, abhors a vacuum. We are compelled to fill it. Our imagination rushes in where facts fear to tread, conjuring up scenarios of epic battles, peaceful assimilation, or even supernatural interventions. This lack of a final answer makes the story perpetually unfinished, an open loop in history that we feel a strange, compelling need to close. It becomes a puzzle we are all invited to solve, a riddle whispered from the past that each generation feels uniquely qualified to answer with the tools of its time. Beyond the sheer mystery of the disappearance, we are captivated by the profound human drama at its heart. This wasn't an anonymous group of soldiers or adventurers, it was families. The story of John White, forced to abandon his daughter and infant granddaughter, only to return and find them utterly gone, is a Shakespearean-level tragedy. We can all, on some fundamental level, imagine his anguish. The birth of Virginia Dare adds another layer of potent symbolism. She represents pure potential, new life, and the hope for a future that was brutally severed. Her fate, whether tragic or transformative, becomes a stand-in for the fate of America itself, a promise that was almost immediately broken, a beginning that turned into an enigma. We connect with these people not as historical figures, but as parents, children, and partners, making their unknown fate feel intensely personal and emotionally resonant. Roanoke also holds a unique and powerful place in the American story as our founding mystery. Before Jamestown, before Plymouth Rock, there was this eerie silence. It is the original what-if of the nation. Every country has its creation myths, but America's very first attempt at planting its flag in the New World ended not with a triumphant founding, but with a ghost story. This anomaly sets the tone for a national identity that is often preoccupied with themes of disappearance, rebirth, and the haunting nature of the wilderness. It serves as a humbling prologue, a reminder that the narrative of manifest destiny and inevitable expansion was predicated on fragility, failure, and the immense power of the unknown continent. It's the shadow at the very beginning of our story, a cautionary tale that tempers the myth of unstoppable progress. Ultimately, the lost colony stands as the ultimate symbol of vulnerability. The early colonial effort was a breathtakingly audacious gamble, a bet that a handful of people using 16th-century technology could cross a terrifying ocean and tame a vast, unknown land. Roanoke is the stark evidence of how that bet could fail. It showcases the terrifyingly thin margin for error these pioneers faced. A delayed supply ship, a change in weather, a strained relationship with a local tribe, a prolonged drought, any single variable could spell doom. Their disappearance is a powerful lesson in the fragility of human ambition when confronted with the immense, indifferent forces of nature and circumstance. We are captivated because their story is a magnification of our own deepest anxieties about survival, community, and being utterly lost. It forces us to confront the terrifying possibility that entire chapters of human endeavor can be erased, leaving behind only a single cryptic word and a silence that has lasted for centuries. So where does all of this evidence leave us? The most compelling clues point not to a single catastrophic end, but to a complex story of resilience and adaptation. The orderly departure from Roanoke, the deliberate omission of the distress cross, and the clear direction of the CROATOAN carving strongly suggest a planned relocation, not a panicked flight. The archaeological treasures unearthed on Hatteras Island, the rapier hilt, the writing slate, the gold aglet found amidst CROATOAN village remains paint a vivid picture of trade, coexistence, and likely integration. This is powerfully supported by the discovery of Site X on John White's secret map, and the subsequent unearthing of Elizabethan artifacts like Border, where pottery and gun parts 50 miles inland, seamlessly blended with the material culture of the Weepameok or Roanoke people. This dual evidence suggests a plausible scenario where the colonists, facing the unimaginable pressure of an 800-year megadrought, made a rational choice to split into smaller groups. Some likely went south to their known allies, the CROATOAN, seeking refuge and ultimately merging with the community through marriage and mutual dependence. Others may have ventured west to the predetermined fallback position, carrying their skills and possessions into the interior and gradually becoming part of a different native society. The story that emerges is not one of a people erased, but of a community transformed, their English identity slowly dissolving into the complex tapestry of indigenous America. This enduring mystery, however, is about far more than just figuring out what happened to 115 people. The story of the lost colony serves as a profound microcosm of the entire early American experience. It reveals the breathtaking audacity and terrifying fragility of those first colonial ventures, where the fate of an entire community hinged on the timing of a supply ship or the arrival of seasonal rains. It lays bare the complex and often tragic nature of cultural encounters, where initial curiosity and exchange could so quickly spiral into suspicion, violence, and misunderstanding, fueled by environmental pressures and a fundamental failure to comprehend the other. Most of all, the saga of Roanoke is a timeless testament to human resilience. When faced with the collapse of their world and the failure of all their plans, these men, women, and children did not simply give up. They made a choice. They packed up their lives, left a message for those who might come looking, and walked courageously into the complete unknown, relying on wit, diplomacy, and hope to secure their survival. Their legacy is not a pile of bones and a solved mystery, but a powerful lesson in adaptation. Perhaps the true lesson of Roanoke is that some histories are not meant to have a neat and tidy ending. The absence of a final answer is itself the point, inviting us to continually question, to explore, and to remember that the past is not a closed book but a living conversation. The search continues even now, with each new technological advance and each fresh perspective offering another piece of the puzzle. What do you think happened? Did they find sanctuary with Mantio's people on Hatteras Island? Did they journey inland to merge with another community? Or does the truth lie in some combination of events we have yet to fully uncover? Share your own theories and thoughts in the comments below. I absolutely love reading them. And if you're as captivated by this mystery as I am, you can dive even deeper into the ongoing research. I've included links in the description to the First Colony Foundation and the Lost Colony Center for Science and Research, where you can see the latest discoveries for yourself and follow the story as it continues to unfold even after 400 years.